Angkor in the heart of what is now Cambodia, somewhere around the 12th century. This is, by most estimates, the largest urban settlement on the face of the earth at that moment in history, a sprawling capital of temples, canals, and reservoirs housing perhaps 750,000 people, at a time when London and Paris were still muddy provincial towns a fraction of that size. None of it, not the towering spires of Angkor, not the army of stone carvers, not the royal court with its elephants and its bureaucracy, would have been possible without a single, unglamorous crop growing in the flooded fields stretching out beyond the city walls. Rice. Angkor's engineers had built an almost unimaginably vast network of barrays, enormous man-made reservoirs, and canals that allowed farmers to harvest not once but 2 or even 3 times a year, producing a surplus so large it could feed soldiers, priests, stonemasons, and royalty who grew none of their own food at all. It was rice, quite literally, that built the temples tourists now travel across the world to photograph. And yet, centuries later, this same civilization that had engineered one of the most sophisticated rice economies in human history would collapse, its canals silting up, its fields failing, its population scattering into the jungle that eventually swallowed the city whole. The grain that built Angkor may also have been part of what unmade it. But to understand how a single crop could raise an empire from wetlands and then let it slip back into the forest, we have to go back far earlier than any king of Angkor, back roughly 9,000 years, to a stretch of marshy riverbank in southern China where nobody had yet given this plant a name. Contemporary Chinese and Chola envoys who visited the Khmer capital left written accounts describing markets overflowing with rice, fish pulled from the reservoirs, and a countryside so intensively farmed that famine, at the empire's height, was said to be almost unknown, a claim that later centuries would make impossible to sustain. Southern China, somewhere between 9 and 11,000 years ago, long before anyone had invented writing, long before anyone had built a single city anywhere on Earth. Along the marshy banks of the Yangtze River, small bands of hunter-gatherers are harvesting a wild grass that grows thickly in the shallow water. Botanists today call it Oryza rufipagon. In the wild, this grass drops its ripe seeds onto the ground almost immediately, scattering itself before anyone can gather it in any useful quantity. But something strange begins happening over the span of many, many generations. Without any concept of genetics, without any idea that they were doing anything at all beyond simply eating, these early foragers begin favoring the plants whose seeds cling a little longer to the stalk, the ones that are easier to harvest in bulk before they scatter into the mud. Gather enough of those seeds, replant them season after season, and eventually the population of grass itself begins to shift. Excavations at sites such as Shangshan and later Himudu, in the lower reaches of the Yangtze Basin, have turned up pottery fragments with rice husks pressed into the clay, charred grains preserved in ancient storage pits dug into the earth, and wooden implements shaped for working soil that is wet and heavy. By roughly 8,000 years ago, what had started as casual foraging had become deliberate, repeated cultivation. This was not a single flash of insight by one brilliant individual. It was centuries of accumulated trial, flood, drought, and failure, carried out by countless farmers whose names will never appear in any record, who had no idea that they were quietly reshaping a wild grass into the crop that would one day feed more human beings than any other single food on the planet. From those first flooded fields, the plant, and the knowledge of how to grow it, began spreading outward, following rivers and coastlines in every direction, carried by people who had no map of where the journey would eventually end. Later excavations at additional sites along the middle and lower Yangtze, including Diatongwen and Bashadang, have pushed the timeline of experimentation back even further, with some carbonized grains and phytolith evidence suggesting that people were already gathering and lightly managing wild rice stands well before 8,000 years ago, blurring the line between simple foraging and true agriculture in a way that continues to occupy archaeologists today. 2 branches. That is what modern genetic analysis has found at the root of nearly every bowl of rice eaten anywhere on Earth. As cultivation spread outward from the Yangtze Basin, the plant split into 2 major lineages, shaped by the very different climates it encountered. Japonica, short-grained and sticky when cooked, adapted to the cooler, drier conditions of the north, eventually carried across the sea to the Korean peninsula and the Japanese archipelago. Indica, long-grained and fluffier, thrived instead in the hot, waterlogged lowlands stretching south and west, through what is now Vietnam, Thailand, and eventually deep into the river valleys of South Asia. This was not a rapid migration. It took thousands of years, moving at the pace of human settlement itself, carried in the memory of farmers rather than on any ship or cart, since wheeled transport and long-distance trade routes were still far in the future. By roughly 4,000 years ago, rice cultivation had reached the Ganges Basin in what is now northern India, arriving through a combination of routes from both the northeast and the northwest, and had firmly established itself along the Korean coast and in scattered pockets of the Japanese islands. Wherever it arrived, it did not simply replace what people were already eating. It reorganized their entire relationship with land and water, because rice, unlike wheat or millet, thrives when its roots sit in standing water for much of the growing season, which meant that communities that adopted it also had to master something else entirely: how to move, hold, and share water across an entire landscape, cooperatively, season after season, or the crop would fail for everyone at once. That single requirement, shared water for a shared crop, would end up shaping the social structure of entire civilizations for thousands of years to come, long before any of them had a word for irrigation. Genetic studies comparing modern rice varieties across Asia have confirmed this two-branch picture with remarkable clarity, showing that Japonica and Indica diverged genetically long before either reached the distant regions where they are grown today, a split etched into the DNA of the plant itself millennia before anyone thought to look for it. By the time organized dynasties rose along the Yellow River and the Yangtze, rice had become something far larger than food. It had become the measure by which a government's legitimacy itself was judged. Ancient Chinese states built enormous granaries not simply to survive lean years, but as a direct expression of political power, and the philosophy that grew up around agriculture in ancient China treated the full or empty state of those granaries as a moral signal, not merely an economic one. A ruler who kept the granaries full and distributed grain wisely during flood or drought was seen as holding what later Confucian scholars would call the mandate of heaven, a kind of cosmic permission to govern. A ruler whose granaries stood empty while officials hoarded rice for private gain, or whose irrigation canals fell into disrepair, was seen as having lost that mandate entirely, and history shows that peasant uprisings sparked by hunger and grain shortages toppled ruling houses again and again across the centuries of ancient Chinese history. Local officials were required to keep meticulous records of harvests, of grain stored, and of grain distributed, records so detailed that some surviving fragments allow modern historians to reconstruct harvest failures that occurred well over 2,000 years ago. Rice was also used in various ancient Chinese states as a form of tax payment and, at times, as a unit of account for wages owed to laborers and officials, functioning as a kind of currency long before coin money became widespread. An empire that could feed its people in the ancient Chinese worldview had proven its right to rule them. An empire that could not was, sooner or later, an empire already in the process of falling. Some of the oldest surviving Chinese oracle bone inscriptions, used for divination during the Shang dynasty more than 3,000 years ago, include characters referring to grain harvests and offerings, evidence that agricultural record-keeping and religious ritual were intertwined from an extremely early stage in Chinese civilization, long before any formal bureaucracy existed to manage it. Rice reached the Indian subcontinent through more than one route, arriving from the east through what is now Myanmar and from the north along ancient trade paths, and by the time the earliest layers of Vedic literature were being composed, somewhere in the 2nd millennium BCE, rice already occupied a place of profound religious significance. In the Rigveda and later texts, rice, referred to as vrihi in Sanskrit, appears repeatedly in descriptions of ritual offerings, cooked and presented to deities as one of the most valued substances a household could offer. Grains of rice were, and in many communities still are, thrown at weddings as a blessing of fertility and abundance, tossed into sacred fires during rituals meant to ensure a good harvest, and offered at funerals as sustenance for the journey of the departed soul. Archaeological evidence from sites in the Ganges Basin, including carbonized rice grains recovered from settlements dated to around 1500 BCE, confirms that cultivation was already well established across the region by the time these religious texts were taking shape. Ancient Indian agricultural treatises describe elaborate systems for classifying rice by season, by soil type, and by the amount of water each variety required, distinguishing between rice sown before the monsoon and rice sown after it, a level of agronomic detail that suggests centuries of accumulated farming experience standing behind the words. Kingdoms across ancient India, from the Gangetic Plains to the river deltas of the south, built their tax systems and their food reserves around the rice harvest, and just as in ancient China, a failed monsoon and a failed rice crop could threaten the stability of a throne as directly as any invading army, which is part of why so many ancient Indian rulers invested heavily in tanks, canals, and reservoirs specifically built to protect the rice fields their kingdoms depended upon. Later Sanskrit agricultural manuals go so far as to describe methods for testing soil quality by taste and by how quickly it absorbed water, instructions clearly drawn from generations of accumulated trial and observation rather than any single moment of invention. Rice cultivation reached the Japanese archipelago from the Asian mainland during what archaeologists call the Yayoi period, beginning somewhere around the 3rd century BCE, and its arrival marks one of the sharpest cultural turning points in Japan's ancient history. Before wet field rice farming appeared, the earlier Jaman population had lived for thousands of years as hunter-gatherers, fishing, foraging, and moving with the seasons. Wet rice agriculture required something entirely different: permanent settlement, communal management of irrigation channels, and coordinated labor across an entire village, since a single household could not build or maintain a paddy system alone. Within a few centuries, this shift had reorganized Japanese society from small mobile bands into fixed farming communities with defined leadership, stored surplus, and, eventually, the beginnings of social ranking based on control of rice-producing land. This transformation left its mark most visibly in religion. Shinto belief came to treat rice cultivation as something close to sacred labor, and Inari, the deity most closely associated with rice, agriculture, and prosperity, became one of the most widely venerated figures in the entire Shinto pantheon, honored today at tens of thousands of shrines across the country. Ancient harvest rituals evolved into some of the most important ceremonial occasions of the year, moments when entire communities paused ordinary life to give thanks for a crop whose failure meant hunger within a single season. Even the enthronement of a new emperor came to include a rice-related ritual, the daijosai, in which freshly harvested rice was offered to the gods as part of confirming the new ruler's legitimacy, a ceremony whose roots stretch back deep into Japan's ancient past. A single crop, arriving from across the sea, had reorganized not only how people ate, but how an entire civilization understood its own government, its own calendar, and its own relationship to the divine. Excavated yayoi settlements such as Toro, in what is now Shizuoka Prefecture, preserve the outlines of ancient paddy fields, irrigation ditches, and raised floor granaries built specifically to keep harvested rice safe from moisture and rodents, physical evidence of just how quickly and thoroughly this single imported crop reorganized the practical, everyday architecture of ancient Japanese life. Return now to Angkor, where this story began, and look more closely at what actually happened there. The Khmer engineers who built the city's water system were not simply digging reservoirs at random. The West Baray alone, one of several enormous reservoirs built to store monsoon rainfall for the dry season, stretched roughly 8 kilometers long and 2 kilometers wide, an engineering feat that allowed rice fields around the capital to be irrigated even during months when no rain fell at all. This hydraulic system is what allowed Angkor's population to grow far beyond what rainfall alone could ever have supported, and it is what allowed the Khmer state to extract enough of a rice surplus to fund an empire, including the labor and resources needed to construct temple complexes on a scale unmatched anywhere else in the region. But a system this dependent on precise water management was also extraordinarily fragile. Modern researchers studying sediment cores and tree ring records have found evidence of a series of severe droughts followed by unusually intense monsoon flooding during the 14th and 15th centuries. Extreme swings that appear to have overwhelmed Angkor's canals and reservoirs, causing catastrophic damage to a network that had never been designed to absorb shocks of that magnitude. Silt built up in channels faster than laborers could clear it. Fields that had produced 2 or 3 harvests a year began producing far less. A city whose entire existence depended on rice surplus found that surplus disappearing, and with it, gradually, the population that the surplus had once supported. By the 15th century, the royal court had relocated, and within a relatively short span of time, the jungle had begun reclaiming temples that had once stood at the center of the largest urban settlement on the planet. The same grain and the same water that had allowed Angkor to rise higher than any city of its era were, in the end, part of what allowed it to fall. French naturalist Henri Mouhot, who brought Angkor to wider outside attention in the 19th century after encountering it engulfed in jungle, describes standing before temples whose builders had once commanded a rice surplus larger than anything Europe of that era could imagine, silent now beneath centuries of vegetation. On the island of Bali, a different kind of ancient water system emerged, one built not by a centralized royal bureaucracy but by farming communities themselves, and remarkably, in modified form, it is still functioning today, more than 1,000 years after its earliest recorded origins. It is called Subak, a cooperative network of canals, water temples, and shared planting schedules that determines how water flows from mountain crater lakes down through terraced rice fields to the sea. Inscriptions confirming the existence of organized Subak associations date back to at least the 9th century CE, and oral tradition places its roots even earlier. What makes Subak remarkable is not simply its engineering but its governing philosophy, rooted in a concept called Tri-Hita Karana, which holds that harmony must be maintained simultaneously between people, nature, and the spiritual realm, and that rice cultivation itself is one continuous religious act rather than a purely practical one. Farmers coordinate their planting and flooding schedules not through top-down government orders but through consensus reached at water temples, ensuring that one farmer upstream cannot simply take all the water and leave nothing for the fields below, a form of self-organized cooperation that predates almost any written law code on the island. Overseeing this entire system, in Balinese belief, is Dewi Sri, the goddess of rice and fertility, honored with offerings at every stage of the growing cycle, from the first flooding of a field to the final threshing of the harvest. Small shrines dedicated to her still stand at the edge of rice paddies across the island, a direct, physical link between ancient agricultural cooperation and the religious world that grew up to sustain it, proof that in Bali, keeping rice fields watered and honoring the divine were never treated as two separate undertakings, but as a single, uninterrupted act stretching back centuries before any outside power ever set foot on the island. Even the timing of ceremonies at each water temple is calibrated against the needs of the fields downstream, a form of scheduling so intricate that later researchers studying the system concluded it functioned, in effect, as a highly sophisticated pest management strategy long before anyone involved would have described it in those terms. High in the Cordillera mountain range of what is now the northern Philippines, the Ifugao people began an undertaking roughly 2,000 years ago that still defies easy explanation. Without draft animals suited to steep terrain, without metal tools beyond simple hand implements, and without any written engineering tradition, they began carving terraces directly into the mountainsides, stacking flooded rice paddies one above another in staircases that, laid end to end, are often said to stretch for many thousands of kilometers, though the exact figure remains debated among historians. Locals have long called them the stairways to heaven, and walking beneath them, looking up at paddy after paddy climbing toward the clouds, it is easy to understand why. Each terrace wall was built from stone and packed earth, engineered with an internal drainage system that allowed water to move slowly downward from paddy to paddy without eroding the structure beneath. A design so effective that many of these terraces are still in active cultivation today, after roughly 2,000 years of continuous use. Building and maintaining a single terrace required enormous cooperative labor, and a Fugo oral tradition holds that the entire system was not simply an agricultural project but a sacred inheritance, a gift entrusted to the community by ancestral spirits and deities associated with the rice harvest, meaning that neglecting a terrace wall was understood as a spiritual failing as much as a practical one. Rice grown in these high mountain paddies matured more slowly than rice grown in the lowlands, producing smaller harvests but, according to generations of Fugo farmers, a distinctive flavor and quality tied specifically to the altitude, the mineral-rich mountain water, and the particular heirloom varieties, among them one called Tinawan, cultivated nowhere else on earth in quite the same way. What the Fugo accomplished, entirely without the benefit of a centralized state, a formal army of laborers, or any written record of how it was designed, remains one of the most remarkable feats of ancient agricultural engineering anywhere in the world. Even the terrace walls themselves carry inherited knowledge, since builders learned, through generations of trial and failure, precisely how steep a wall could rise before collapsing under the weight of saturated soil, knowledge passed down entirely through observation and apprenticeship rather than any written manual. Long before any ship built specifically for the purpose crossed an ocean, rice had already begun traveling far beyond the rivers where it was first domesticated, carried not by merchants alone but by armies, migrants, and the slow, patient movement of farming communities in search of new land. Historical accounts describe soldiers accompanying Alexander the Great encountering rice cultivation during their campaigns into the Indus Valley around 326 BCE, an encounter that appears to have carried knowledge of the crop back toward the Mediterranean world, where it remained, for centuries afterward, a rare and somewhat exotic import rather than a staple food. Far more consequential was the spread of rice cultivation westward through the expansion of Islamic trade and agricultural knowledge beginning in the 7th and 8th centuries CE, a period agricultural historians sometimes call the Arab Agricultural Revolution, during which crops, irrigation techniques, and farming knowledge moved rapidly across an enormous connected world stretching from Persia and Mesopotamia through North Africa and into the Iberian Peninsula. Rice cultivation took root in the marshlands of southern Iraq, spread into Egypt along the Nile Delta, and eventually reached what is now Spain and Portugal, brought by farmers who carried with them not only seed but entire irrigation systems, including water wheels and channel designs adapted from techniques refined over centuries in Persia and Mesopotamia. In every one of these new environments, rice cultivation demanded exactly what it had always demanded since those first fields beside the Yangtze: standing water, cooperative management, and communities willing to reorganize their entire relationship with land around the needs of a single, demanding grain. What had begun as a wild grass along one river in southern China had, within a few thousand years, crossed deserts, mountain ranges, and seas, adapting itself and being adapted by a bewildering range of climates, languages, and belief systems, arriving each time not merely as a food but as an entire way of organizing a landscape and the people who depended upon it. Chinese travelers and Buddhist pilgrims moving along overland routes through Central Asia likewise carried accounts of rice cultivation eastward and back again, adding yet another thread to a slow, centuries-long exchange of agricultural knowledge that connected farming communities separated by thousands of kilometers long before any of them had a name for the network they were quietly building. Nobody standing on that marshy riverbank beside the Yangtze 9 or 10,000 years ago, quietly gathering seeds from grass that clung a little longer to its stalk than the plants around it, could have imagined any of what came after. They could not have imagined temples rising above flooded fields in Cambodia, fed by canals engineered to hold an entire monsoon season's worth of rain. They could not have imagined Vedic priests offering handfuls of the same grain into sacred fires on the far side of a mountain range, or a Japanese emperor's enthronement built around a ritual offering of the freshly cut harvest, or terraces climbing 2,000 meters up a mountainside in the Philippines, carved by hand across 2,000 years without a single written blueprint, or farmers in Bali dividing mountain water between fields through consensus reached at temples rather than through the order of any king. They could not have imagined a grass from a Chinese riverbank crossing deserts and mountain ranges to take root in the marshlands of Mesopotamia and the river valleys of Iberia, carried by traders and farmers who had never heard of the Yangtze and never would. And they certainly could not have imagined that a civilization capable of building the largest city on earth around this single crop, an empire of stone temples and engineered reservoirs, could also, centuries later, watch that same system of water and rice quietly fail beneath it, its canals silting shut, its fields going empty, its people scattering into a jungle that would spend the following centuries slowly reclaiming everything they had built. What those first anonymous foragers accomplished was not simply the domestication of a useful plant. It was the creation of a force capable of raising cities, organizing entire religions, legitimizing or delegitimizing kings, and reshaping the very geography of water across half a continent, all beginning with nothing more than a decision, repeated quietly across countless seasons, to keep the seeds that stayed a little longer on the stalk. And yet every terrace, every canal, every offering left at a rice goddess's shrine across all these separate civilizations traces back to that same single decision, made independently by no one in particular and by everyone at once, to keep watching a wild grass a little more closely than the plants growing beside it.